The largest brain waves that are detected are created by these certain neuronal cells. And these neuronal cells, you'll be interested to find, are very large. They're the largest, and they're in the shape of a pyramid. So they're actually pyramidal shaped. If you look at the physical neurons in our brain, why is it shaped like a pyramid?
Chris Lehto, welcome to LehtoFiles.
Welcome. I'm here with JP Hague. He's actually lives in Mauritius with background in international law, and he has fallen into the UAP phenomena. He set up our Egypt trip. And so I'm so happy to have you on the show, JP. How are you doing?
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be with you again after our incredible journey around Egypt. And, obviously I knew who you were, and I love the analysis that you did on certain UFO events, particularly the one that stays with me is the one in the Turkish incident where you see this craft in the sky and what appears to be a being that's sort of sat in it. And that was the best analysis that I've seen on that case. So that's when I first kind of came into the LehtoFiles and knew who you were. And it was an amazing discovery that, to learn that you were coming to Egypt with us. And we spent a lot of time talking and sharing stories, that kind of thing. And it was an amazing trip, and the whole group gelled fantastically. And I feel a lot of changes happened within us during that sort of just under 2 week period. And it's only kind of when you get back to where you live, me in Mauritius, and you're over in Portugal, that you start to integrate these experiences and try to figure out what feels different about self, and what may have happened, and it happens on a really subtle level, as I just said. So it's really nice to catch up with you again, and we can talk UFOs in Egypt.
Yeah, so what inspired you to explore UAPs and ancient Egypt? Do you think these two interests are interlinked?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I came into the UFO subject initially through being titillated by a friend that showed me some footage on YouTube back in 2008, and he managed computer systems for an offshore bank in London, and he basically said to me, um, this footage appears to have been leaked from covert satellites, and it shows objects in space, in deep space. And I didn't believe him, but I looked at it, and it was interesting. You sort of saw these outlines of kind of etheric type looking objects, craft, and I sort of dismissed it, but I thought I'd look into the subject, so I did, and it became fairly obvious that there was this a fairly obvious information block, especially from the US and particularly the UK government. So that in itself was a problem, and it was around that time, it was 2009, early 2010, where I saw a UFO for the first time over the skyline of London, and it sort of appeared just in synchronization with the thought, is this real or not? And then I see this metallic object that looks like a diamond-shaped object, and it's sort of materializing or dematerializing into visible light, and it's reflecting the sunlight. Then it disappears. It could have been cloaking. I don't know. It could have been a hallucination, but I doubt that very much. It's not uncommon. So that was my kind of baptism of fire into witnessing a UFO and starting to investigate the phenomena. And the more I went down that path, the more obvious it seemed to me to try and look at whether this had happened in the past, which instinctively obviously would have happened. And I think Egypt is probably the best signature in terms of ancient civilizations that show this, and advanced technology in terms of construction, in terms of knowledge, agriculture, um, uh, astrology, and particularly spirituality. And the idea of integrating all these disciplines into a way of living, to a point where none of them are really separable one from the other, which is completely antithetic to how we live in the Western world today, where everything is specialized and separated, and so on and so forth. And so I started going to Egypt. First of all, scuba diving in the Red Sea. I just saw some amazing shipwrecks and reefs and fish and sharks. And then I started to come to Egypt after having contact with these or witnessing these objects or phenomena, um, with a view to actually trying to discover whether I felt there was a genuine connection between the two, and I think there is. And this has been now my third or fourth trip, and every time is different. You see the same sites, but you see them differently. You often pick up on little details or nuances of areas and sites that you haven't seen before. So you're constantly learning. And what's sad is, I think, is that most tourists that go there, most visitors, I should say, tend to kind of have a standardized tour and they're rushing around the sites and they don't learn anything other than, well, this is what the Egyptological format or story behind the site is. So it was really to try and kind of run counter to that official so-called narrative that Egyptology often pushes and defends rigorously, because people need to see it for themselves firstly, and they also need to experience the sites in a sense that they do seem to affect people, particularly those who are more sensitive to phenomena than others. So that was the whole idea. I teamed up with our good friend Ross Coulthart, who is pushing the needle forward massively in terms of exposing, the so-called cover-up of UAPs, and even in terms of human history as to, what happened in Egypt. How do we reconcile that now in the kind of modern era when we see congressional hearings happening? And I think, a piece on News Nation will come out that connects the two. And he's obviously looking to put out a story shortly on crash retrievals, which is very much what in alignment with what the X-Files were showing us back in the 90s. So I think the ideas that we're uncovering now are nothing new. They're just being rediscovered, and they're shocking because the way that Western civilization has kind of functioned and has been set up, and in terms of how it's disciplined, finds all of this very uncomfortable as compared to, say, Eastern cultures or Asian cultures. So, there needs to be a bridge between these two worlds, and we're doing it through stories or uncovering of information that's been hidden that isn't particularly surprising to the likes of you and I, because we've been looking at this for a long time, and seeing how that fits in with the ancient civilizations in terms of technology. We often think about anti-gravity associated with these UAPs. They have, 5 characteristics that the ORSAT ATIP teams came up with, but they apparently were also using such techniques or technology to actually construct buildings or temples, as we saw, or what was alluded to in the stories that the temples present. And in fact, just looking at how they've been extracted, put together, moved, and used. So yeah, there's a deep connection, and it takes time to unpick or unpack all these aspects in a world where we're really told this is how it is, and you face ridicule or castigation, setting aside if you're in the academic sphere, for challenging it. So it's basically people like us that are just from various disciplines just coming together and trying to piece this together ourselves and just use common sense and accept that it may be true, it may not be, and just being open-minded and coming to our own conclusions. And it's really the alternative movement that's taking things forward, and the observations are completely legitimate. What we need is more time and more evidence. And if there wasn't a cover-up in both the Egyptological sphere and the UAP sphere, it would be a lot easier to do. So you can't blame people for trying to work it out themselves.
You mentioned a cover up I found it very interesting as we're traveling all through Egypt. There were so many hieroglyphics. The temples were just covered with hieroglyphics. I was expecting what I've seen here in Europe, where they have ancient societies. You go and there's maybe one little patch of a wall, and they say, okay, that's original. And you look and there's maybe a 1 meter by 1 meter kind of section. But in Egypt, it was everywhere. You have giant temples completely filled to the brim, 20-meter high sections of just massive hieroglyphs depicting all these different scenes. It seems like they had so much written, and yet there was no information on anything about building the pyramids. There was nothing about how they moved or cut any of the extremely hard red granite stone. It had a hardness of 7, which is basically harder than stainless steel. All they had was copper tools and maybe some sand. I've seen that maybe that they used copper tools along with emery sand, which is really hard and had some techniques. But as we saw there with the unfinished obelisk, and then the what I thought one of the most convincing pieces of evidence was the unfinished red granite box that was in the Museum of Cairo, where it really looks like some sort of machine was effectively cutting the lid off of that box to make those large sarcophagus. So is that what you mean by the cover up? Do you think that's been covered up? Is that the ancient technology that you're referring to that relates to our modern day time of a cover up?
I think that's part of it. And yeah, I mean, they're putting it out on display. But I mean, for example, that box you mentioned at the Old Cairo Museum is wedged right against the back of a wall. So for most people, they're not going to, think to go behind it because there's barely any space to maneuver. And it's subtle. Like it really is subtle. And what I said to the group and you, I think, Chris, is that there's lots of kind of coincidences and if you dismiss all of them together, it doesn't make much sense. And I think if we are seeing anything up to say 200-ton blocks, for example, at the Vadi Temple in front of the Sphinx on the Giza plateau, how are they maneuvering them with logs and sand and so on? But then if you say we turn to Dendara Temple, where there's a mural there, and in Edfu Temple particularly, where there's tons of this depiction. You see these large beings with these rods. They're preparing the temple ground. You see the temple on the floor. They're using these rods, and you see these dotted lines that kind of suggest there's energy. And then in the next mural, they're raising the temple off the ground. And frankly, when we look at the size and the precision of these sites in terms of the size of these megalithic blocks, their material being diorite, granite, limestone, which is an insulator, the orientation of them in terms of alignment with coordinates on the Earth and the stars, you know, the geometry of it all, before we even get into the building, to be honest, is astounding. And you just have to ask, where did this come from? Was it from us? Was it from elsewhere and then transmitted to us and then lost over time, which is what I think happened, speculating. And so there is I hate to say it, this in plain sight aspect to it, where you can see these anomalies. For example, at the unfinished obelisk, this giant 36-meter obelisk in Aswan, where they started extracting, perfectly, this enormous obelisk from a red granite quarry. But what you're seeing are around the shape of the obelisk, where it's been excavated, partially excavated, are these scoop marks, like somebody's just sort of put a scoop into the red granite like ice cream, and it's as smooth as you like, which kind of flies in the face of what the museum, the museum, quote unquote, museum was closed when we went there. But on previous visits, the video was Dr. Zahi Hawass, the former antiquities minister, suggesting that people were smacking softer rock against the harder number 7 on the dial, red granite, extracting it, which would have taken forever if that was even achievable at all. So it's there is this schism and this disconnect that is literally in your face when you get there, but you actually have to go there to believe it, to see it. Um, Another example, you go to the step pyramid with its 7 initiatic levels of Saqqara. I mean, it's called Jossa's pyramid, but the likelihood is it's much older than that. Um, and next to it, you have the Unas pyramid, where, we're told that the oldest sacred texts are hidden underneath it. You can go in and access it privately, I think. Um, so, this site's really old, but what we don't really hear about, and again, it's in plain sight or in plain hearing actually, is the fact that you have this temple structure just next to it where you can hear natural resonance from within the chambers, which are made of limestone. And how have they achieved that? Where is that sound or that resonance coming from? Well, it's the way that they have built this genius piece of architecture. And then it becomes a question of what was the purpose of it? Why did they do this? And I mean, certain of us were just sort of standing in these chambers, and it was like going into another field of awareness. And it's super mysterious. And I think that the Egyptians, when I say the Egyptians, it's like an onion. There are different layers to the onion, and it's multiple. It's not just one movement or set of people. But I think what we're talking about is this prehistory, antediluvian period where we just simply don't know who was here and how they did it with just this precision and this ingenuity that we frankly have lost today. So there is an aspect that's in plain sight, but there is, according to the research of somebody I've spoken to recently, and I don't want to peddle his name about too much, but he spent a lot of time on the Giza plateau, and he and associate of his have witnessed the more insidious type of cover-up, which is what they think is happening, and it's been going on for decades. And I'm talking about the removal or the extraction of artifacts at night underneath the Sphinx area, and there's up to, I think, about 6 to 8 secret entrances around the Sphinx that we're not really educated about, and potential removal of a body. And it's been said that it may be a non-human body that was mummified and put into a casket. And workers were killed during that process. So, we don't really know the veracity of this, but there are people that I trust that have actually spent a lot of time monitoring this, and other Egyptologists too. And it's very much hush hush, because, well, first of all, you don't want to get yourself barred from entering the country if you're interested or you're studying academically in this field. But there's something very unsavory that appears to have been going on for a long time, and it's in the same vein. The same thing has been happening in terms of the UFO cover-up that we are starting to see unravel a little in the States, and activities that are frankly uh, heinous in terms of taking out craft or objects that are non-human in origin. And of course, there are pilots inside, and perhaps it's not just automated or a form of AI. There may be pilots inside. So, you know, again, the real problem is really us, in terms of we seem to be getting in the way of ourselves through self-interest and preservation of power through ignorance. Like, well, it sounds super conspiratorial, but it's actually true in the sense that that's how you maintain a status quo. And it's sad. So the more people come to Egypt and see and experience these sites for themselves, the more they can reach their own conclusions as to where the truth may lie. So I think that's what I want to say about the nuances of cover up.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for sharing. I know it's difficult. You don't want to give away sources, etc. Like you said, bar yourself from entering the country. Yeah, I had a similar kind of feeling as the amazing precision, of the Great Pyramid, for instance, just blew my mind. If you start at one side of the pyramid, any level, and you trace it across, it's just this perfect perfect line, as if it was cut with lasers essentially. And you consider 2.6 million blocks, and they're each 3 to 15 tons. Um, it was amazing to me, the precision. Not only that, but if it was done, say, by a large civilization where they say, okay, it took they had all this labor, they had, thousands or millions of slaves, if you will, that doing all this labor, that would require an amazing amount of coordination. Coordination. There should be documents. If we're talking about a civilization, I mean, the only way we understand a civilization works is through a bureaucracy, right? And a bureaucracy always has some sort of communication. How are you going to communicate across hundreds or thousands of people to line up these blocks perfectly? And how are you going to move them? How are you going to get the precision so accurate? So for me, there should have been some records, and that really was blatantly obvious to me, is that there's no records. There was nothing on any of those thousands of hieroglyphs that we saw on any of the walls, no records of anything, and then the miraculous precision. And then what you mentioned there, what really stood out to me was the wand. On several of those temples, you basically had some deity or god or figure holding what looks like, a magic wand that we would call. And then, like you mentioned, the little dots of energy or whatever it is, linking it to a temple or a gate or something. Um, and that reminded me exactly of what Michael Herrera said. Michael Herrera said in the book that he actually forwarded and said was released by whistleblowers, Sentinels of Ether. And it's a very interesting book. And they only were able to release the first few chapters, but in the second chapter, I believe, what ends up happening is the rogue group, they fly into a mountain, and when they get inside the mountain, there's one person there, and he has a glove on with a magic wand, and he moves the container around using some sort of levitation technology. I remember that from Sentinels of Ether. And when we were looking at all these depictions on the wall, that's what I thought of, was that wand, that scene in that book, Sentinels of Ether. So it just stood out to me. And then the final part that really kind of sealed the deal, we already talked about the unfinished obelisk and the unfinished box, was the water erosion. We were there. It hasn't rained in Egypt in 7,000 years, I believe, is what they talked about, since the last ice age, essentially. But when you look at the rocks on the, I can't remember, there's the Moon pyramid that we went to, I believe. Is that the one that had the erosion?
There's Maidun, but I suppose the real signature is the bedrock around the Sphinx, and the fact that it was in a pool of water, and you can see the water line, up on the viewing platform area where the general public go whilst we were inside, which goes back tens of thousands of years. And so the Sphinx was there before then. And I think it's Dr. Robert Schoch from Boston University that went around dating this in the 90s, and lo and behold, they then started repairing and changing the blocks around the pores and the body of the Sphinx as soon as he'd finished his work. But it's interesting. You mentioned the Great Pyramid. I think the Great Pyramid is the most iconic seventh wonder of one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. And you mentioned, how is it possible for a group of men to achieve this in the time that they did? And you're right. I mean, the Great Pyramid is made of something like 2.3 to 2.5, I think it's 2.3 million blocks of granite and limestone. And these are weighing anything between 25 to 80 tons each. And Egyptology says that it was constructed over a period of around 20 years. So that basically means if you've got, if you calculate the figures, and we did this, that means you're moving 13 megalithic blocks per hour, 24 hours a day, each day, 365 days of the year, without any interruption whatsoever. And it would have cost around $5 billion to do all of this, by the way. So it's ridiculous. How did they do it? And like I mentioned before, even before we look at the construction, the architecture or the positioning of this marvel is just something else. It's on the geographic center of all of Earth's landmass. It's on the 30th parallel north of latitude in the northern hemisphere, and this is a perfect ratio of distance on which other key sites around the world are built. And I think of Angkor Wat is another example in Cambodia. Slightly controversial, but it's still interesting. I mean, you see that there are these latitude coordinates of 29.97 degrees north that when you play out the full figure, it equates to the exact speed of light, which is, 299,792 plus thousand meters per second. But I think, we need to factor in the tectonic plate movements, but it's pretty damn close. Another really interesting point I picked up on, Chris, is the obliquity of Earth's axis, which is 23.5 degrees. And if you take the corner angle of each angle of the pyramid base, and you connect those angles to the king's chamber, you've got 23.5 degrees.
Wow.
If you connect those corner angles to the queen's chamber, which is slightly lower down, and we went there after the king's chamber, and you double that figure, you get 23.5 degrees. I mean, it's unbelievable. And another thing, which I love, engineer Robert Bauval had the thought or the idea that the three pyramids of Giza correlate to the three stars in Orion's belt, in the constellation of Orion, Alnitak, and I forget the name of the other two. But, was that where Orion's belt was aligned 10,000 years ago? Apparently so. If we take, there's a final thing I think of, if you take the ratio of the slant height to half the base length of the pyramid, you're close to the golden ratio, or what's called the divine proportion, which is basically a proportional figure, 1.61 or so, that is constantly recurring in nature. And the final thing I should mention on this architectural masterpiece, before we even get to how they constructed it, is we call it the precession of the equinoxes, which is Earth's wobble. We multiply the base perimeter by 43,200, you get the equatorial circumference, and it's also 43,200 years for the Earth to complete this wobble, and it takes 72 years for 1 degree of motion. So, I mean, they had this absolute understanding and mastery of Earth and its geometry and its positioning, and it is divine. It's incredible. And then we get to how did they actually construct it? Who had that blueprint, those plans, and how was it executed? Because when you're inside, and I'd like to know your thoughts. I mean, the first thing you notice is the acoustics. Like everything is precision packed together, the granite, and it echoes, it resonates. And I mean, I know people that have been inside the pyramid at night, and you can hear someone in the subterranean chamber all the way up in the king's chamber if you make the right, tones or whatever. So, there is this divine ingenuity behind this object, this marvel. And I mean, you just look at it. If you go to the Giza plateau and you just stand there, you feel like you're in a different world. It's otherworldly, and there's nothing like it that we know. There are other pyramids around the earth, but there is nothing like this. And my real suspicion and perception is that let's take the Great Pyramid and simplify it. This was an object that was used for multiple purposes. It wasn't just for one thing. And there's some amazing theories, and the theories have been created by very intelligent people like Christopher Dunn, who talks about the Giza power plant. I think he's right in that these are energetic objects, and we can see that in the electromagnetic spectrum and the scanning that they've done. But you have to ask, why? Why were they doing this? And why is it that certain of us, and many people, have these spontaneous esoteric experiences inside of these buildings? Which means they have a function and they have a relativity or a relationship with us. It's not just the machine, it's for us. and there's a granite box inside the king's chamber that's big enough for a human to get into. It's not a sarcophagus for a body. And again, the Egyptological story has been rolled out and repeated so many times that people are just accepting blindly, frankly, the story behind the three pyramids of Giza and the association with the three kings of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. And the Great Pyramid is Khufu. The story behind the naming of this pyramid is funny because you have a political fraudster who was Colonel Howard Vyse, VYSE, and he needed money and he needed funding. And he was the one who just so happened to discover this very questionable and badly done cartouche inside the Great Pyramid that was badly written in red paint or whatever the material was that was used, saying Khufu. And that is, and the same for Menkaure Pyramid. These are the only links to these kings, and the reason why we call it Khufu or Cheops, which is the Greek version, pyramid. And it's just silly. It's almost childish, this association and assumptions that are made. And it goes for, multiple sites around Egypt where you have these egomaniac pharaohs like Ramses II, the dear pharaoh, who is just going around stamping these sites and just saying, yeah, that's mine. mine. And so Egyptology says, yeah, it's Ramses II. Yeah, he's the guy behind it.
Yeah, you can
So
tell obviously, like it looks Luxor, where there's no pyramid, by the way. You know, if you go to the Luxor in Las Vegas, it's a big pyramid. I was struck that in the actual real Luxor, there's no pyramid, but there are amazing temples. And at the temple
exactly.
at Luxor, you have these giant red granite statues. Again, perfectly symmetric, super hard, one piece. You know, hundreds of tons, and then just stamped into them, like you mentioned there. Obviously, later on, you know, it's off angle. Stamped in later is the names of these pharaohs. You know, where they just added their names on. And
Yeah.
again, like you mentioned there, no record at all of how they created these things. Any record of if there was 20 years of every day putting at least, you know, three of these giant blocks in a perfect laser etch precision, you know, no record of it. What were the purpose of these things, these pyramids? And everyone I went in, none of them at all felt like a tomb. You know, when we went to the Valley of the Kings, there you go through. Even then, it didn't really feel like a tomb, but at least you could say, okay, yeah, this could be a tomb of some place. But the pyramids, every one of the pyramids felt like a machine to me, some type of machine. There was some reason they each
Exactly.
one had those chambers where it was angled, basically an angled chamber. Seemed like some sort of resonance, you know, basically stacked inside. I don't know how to say it correctly. Not a square container, right? So then you think, okay, well, maybe they had to have these types of interior chambers because there's so much weight, right? They like
Yeah.
physically they had to do that. But then, like you mentioned, you go into the king's chamber, and the king's chamber inside of the largest pyramid is a perfect square, right? Or not a perfect square. It's actually cut to precision angles, um, but it's a cube. So physically, you don't have to have those kind of weirdly shaped pyramid interior chambers. You could have a full square, and then all the linking chambers. You know, if it was a tomb, why wouldn't it be like Valley of the Kings, where the actual entrance was large enough for people to get in, you know, to walk in? Every one of the
Yeah.
pyramids that we went in, you have to crawl down backwards, you know, through these tiny little shafts at a weird angle, and there's no steps. You know, in that case, like Christopher Dunn, you mentioned him. It really seems like these were for some type of purpose. You know, that's really what I
Yeah.
felt like. I felt like I was inside of a giant battleship or like a giant reactor or something, you know, thousands of years later, walking through and being like, wonder what this does, you know? It really just felt like a machine. One thought I had after I got back is I was looking into brainwave resonances. You know, how does our brain actually create brain waves? Why does our brain create brain waves? Found very interesting relationships between like alpha theta waves and Schumann resonance. If you look, the Schumann resonance is right around, I think it's 7.2
That's
hertz,
right.
and that's our alpha, and theta is right around 7.2 hertz, which is actually every animal on the planet actually creates brain waves. So every creature that has a brain creates these brain waves. And because I was asking, my dog basically, does my dog create brain waves? And they do, right? They create brain waves roughly equivalent to our brain waves. So based on these same type of frequencies, where could the Schumann resonance of the Earth somehow be related to human brainwave resonances? I know, I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but
No, it
all
doesn't.
science is pseudoscience, right? Until it becomes real science. So
That's
final
right.
point here, when I looked into how does our brain actually create brain waves, the largest brain waves that are detected are created by these certain neuronal cells. And these neuronal cells, you'll be interested to find, are very large. They're the largest, and they're in the shape of a pyramid. So they're actually pyramidal shaped. If you look at the physical neurons in our brain, shaped in these, why is it shaped like a pyramid? So, you try and look, why are the cells in our brain that are creating the largest brain waves that we can detect, why are they shaped like pyramids? Is there an actual reason, an evolutionary reason that's the shape they came to come to? Could that be related somehow to uh, how electromagnetic waves or resonances are actually transmitted is through a certain shape, and maybe a pyramidal shape exactly aligned to certain Earth relationships? Could that somehow have been some sort of weird evolutionary tract that ended up at these pyramids? So anyway, I thought it was an interesting correlation there
Very
after getting
interesting.
back.
Yeah. And I think of the Hermetic principle, there's 7 of them of correspondences, which is as above, so below, on the microscopic scale to the macrocosm. And if you think about the triangle, it's the symbol of the divine and the symbol of fire in alchemy. And the cross is a symbol of the material and the divine or the spiritual meeting, which is what the earth is. It's a meeting place, and there's a reason we have these physical lives and laws that work just up to a certain point, but then we go deeper into it and the relationships change. And you think of the relationship of atoms and protons, electrons, and neutrons. And I think you're right. I think they understood this interaction. You made a really good point. You mentioned about going back to the kind of stamping of items from Ramses II, and you mentioned the fact that Luxor pyramid in Vegas doesn't is there's no pyramid in the real Luxor. And there's something I wanted to touch on about Luxor temple, which is the temple of man. If you look at the work of Lubitz de Schwaler, who did the temple of a huge double-tone book on this temple and its relationship to Karnak temple, the temple of man is Luxor temple, and it's in the shape of a man. And I think the name of it is Ipset Resit, which means the southern sanctuary. And it's said to be constructed by Amenhotep III and our friend Ramses II, of course, and Akhenaten's son, Tutankhamun, or Tutankhamun. You have this avenue of sphinx or sphinxes that kind of lead from Luxor temple, the temple of man, to Karnak temple, which is 1 and a bit kilometers away, which is the temple of the divine and the spiritual. And you see the sphinxes that line this avenue between the two are human heads. And man is a creature of the earth, and it's sort of prostrating on this lion's body, and it's touching the earth, and it's sort of aspiring to go higher. But then when you get to Karnak temple, you see the sphinxes are changing into rams. And the reason we think that is because the ram makes the sound ba, which is the Egyptian name for the soul. So they had this kind of archetypal, iconic logic of the relationship of man and the divine through elements like the name, your physical body, the energetic body, which is like a duplicate of the human body in an energy format, the soul, and the light body, the bodhisattva, as they call it in the Vedic tradition. So you've got this temple in Luxor. It's it feels like a very joyful place. It's beautiful. It's so aesthetic. And you have these amazing statues. There's a statue out the front, which again is said to be Ramses II, though I doubt it. But the symmetry of that face is perfect. And it doesn't matter how good you are with your hands and your tools, you cannot achieve this computerized perfect symmetry on both sides. It's just not possible. How was that done? Was it machined like a CAD, like a computer guided cutting tool? You go inside and you see these beautiful glyphs. There was this obsessive compulsive need to just put hieroglyphs everywhere, and they're often quite repetitive. But what's interesting there is you see these female dancers or yogis, and they're performing these energy postures like a bridge. And it's interesting. They are glorifying the human body in this temple. But I think the biggest enigma for me and for us that we discovered together was right at the back of Luxor Temple, where next to what is a sort of a restoration scaffolding that's been there for at least 4 years in the same small area. It just happens to it's a bit like that granite box at the back of the museum. It has to be put against the museum wall and left there away from eyes. And it's the same here. You've got this guy who's, cleaning up these glyphs, and the scaffolding's been there for 4 years. But what's right next to it are these depictions of Amun-Min, who is a sort of a variation of Amun, a creationary myth, Netta, or God, which is not really the correct term. And he's got this massive erect phallus. He's ejaculating, but on the ejaculation, you see what looks like to be a microscopic sperm. And you just think, well, it's a sperm. Like, the context is so strong. And some go, well, it could be this vase with a little kind of water pouring out. But I think to common sense, it's clearly a sperm. But how would they know that back in those ancient times, in the dynastic era of all? Did they have microscopes at some point? How did they understand this? And also the reverence of the human seed, of man's seed. You see these priests collecting it in a sort of magical type ceremonial fashion in the murals. What is it about us that is beyond the physical in terms of reproduction and the mechanics of life and so on? What is it that's aspiring to be closer to something higher? And that's the question I walk away with. But this area at the back of Luxor Temple was just astonishing. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it isn't a sperm, and it's just all a big coincidence, like everything else in Egypt. But I don't think you ever really see this being discussed on this temple. And ironically, it's called the Temple of Man, so it's all about man, and it's seeding.
Yeah, when we went there, it was difficult to actually get in front of that mural. It seemed like all of the tour groups, that was the highlight of that section. Back there on the side of the main temple room.
Chris, that's the ironic thing is they weren't looking at that. They were looking at the deity or the deification of Alexander the Great, which is next to it. But they're missing the main show, which is next to the scaffolding. That's what's so ironic. But that's what they were looking at, the process of Alexander the Great, who was basically taken over by the priests and using his ego to control him, becoming a god or a deity. And they're all looking at that, and then you're like, we just want to go a bit further on, and then we can see something really exceptional.
You talked about possibly being for a purpose as well. I thought it was really interesting that these pyramids were made out of particularly limestone, right? On the outer edge, inside was red granite. When you got into, for instance, the Great Pyramid and you get to the King's Chamber, it was, highly precisioned red granite, very large blocks. But then the rest of the pyramid was made out of limestone, and it was set on the Giza Plateau, which is a giant limestone plateau. And you could see inside each one of the blocks, if you went and looked at one of the blocks of the pyramid, you saw little tiny microorganisms, basically little tiny animals So essentially, the whole pyramid and everything it's built on is built out of fossilized microorganisms. Now, it's a giant living fossil, if you will, of the pyramid. Do you think that plays a factor into the function of the device, whatever it was?
I think, yeah, limestone it has an insulation property to it, whereas the granite is, it's got a really high quartz content. So, as we know, quartz is used in multiple applications and devices, and it has a memory type property. And it could, the ironic thing is that it could be that, these buildings may have literally been programmed through its natural material. And it's sort of a question as to how can we decode it? How, if this is the case, how are we able to extract records, information from these buildings? Because these buildings are, almost eternal. Paper has something like 1,000 years maximum lifetime. So when we talk about records and halls of records and so on, I think it's a misnomer. It's the buildings themselves and properties within them. I mean, we've had experiences inside there. I've had experiences inside the Great Pyramid in the King's Chamber and the Red Pyramid of Dashur. Super mysterious location. And, it does go into the kind of conspiratorial ancient past type themes. But I think that's the thing. They understood that the need and the scientific necessity of using these natural materials and being harmonious with nature in order to get this hitherto undiscovered science and function to work. Because it's just like I mentioned before, all these disciplines that we segregate and separate and do not really connect because everything has its specialization. They were integrating, which is why I think these sites weren't just symbolic. They are, but they were integrating a scientific, spiritual use, but they were also incorporating the symbolism. But there was no mistake in anything that was done. And I think that the whole of the Giza plateau has a connection. There's definitely underground tunnels and connections that link the entire plateau. It's just that we're not allowed to access some of these places for reasons that we're not really told. And I think this is part of the cover-up we mentioned earlier. I mean, there's a site on the plateau called the Osiris Shaft, which is, private access. And you kind of go 100 feet down into the belly of into the bowels of the earth. And there are these massive boxes that have been projected. They're 100 feet down in the earth, and they've been moved through some kind of force or energy. That's the first level. Then underneath, you have a lake, and you can't physically go into it because it's too deep and you drown. This is the mystery. It's what were they doing? Where did they get this material from? How did they get these boxes down there? And we think of the Serapeum as well in Saqqara. I mean,
for what purpose? Yeah, you mentioned quartz inside the red granite, and that's what we have in all our digital watches. That's how we keep perfect time, way better than an actual mechanical system. So could these have been some sort of digital systems? Are they somehow accessing technology that we haven't really considered, or like you mentioned, may have been hidden?
yeah. And was there a technological component beyond our understanding that's now missing? Is there a missing piece to the jigsaw? Even though we're trying to pick up all these other pieces and put them together, but it's there's nowhere like Egypt on the face of the earth. We're organizing another sort of a part 2 to this tour to Peru in September, October of next year. And I mean, I've been before, but it's almost like it feels like a continuation, possibly at a later date. I'm not sure, but they're just showing off. You have these megalithic rocks that have been molded or fused together, and it sort of suggests that they somehow soften the rock and it sort of reset. Maybe the atomic structure was altered. And when we talk about altering atomic structures of granite and so on. You remember we went to Elephantine Island off Aswan, and you see these diorite in this massive red granite box that's just been projected because of some localized, or maybe even more widespread energetic event, let's say a disaster. And you can see this black line it's not even etched. It's part of the stone. It's like the atomic structure has been changed, and there's this perfect horizontal black line in this red granite box. So I think they were, when we say master masons, they were probably maybe changing the atomic structure and able to manipulate it to do whatever they wanted with it. And then maybe the mass was reforming into what we understand to be natural mass in this reality after whatever it is that they've done to it through vibration or whatever. It's sort of taking its original form and mass. I mean, that's something I thought of. I think Ben Van Kerwick from Uncharted X, he has a similar idea to me in terms of extracting and hewing these rocks. I think they were using probably sound, acoustic type instruments of different shapes and sizes, depending on the work. So sort of larger ones to kind of scoop out that, or atomize, let's say, the red granite, if we think of the unfinished obelisk, but then how to get that incredibly high quality and consistent application of hieroglyphs in some of the more ancient temples like Dendera and Abydos, where the glyphs are just perfect. And it's almost like a template is being used and they're being perfectly, etched without any chisel marks at all. Maybe these were like acoustic styluses or something like that. And maybe the technology was kind of hanging around for some period of time, hundreds, if not maybe 1,000 years, I don't know. And then it kind of got lost. They couldn't maintain them, repair them, who knows? And then you see a much more primitive form of inscription and painting, like in the Valley of the Kings. And I'm not saying that the Valley of the Kings was originally used as a network of tombs. Maybe it was, had something else before, like so many of these sites. But it's not unreasonable to speculate about these kinds of applications when you see the result. And you look at the Assyrian, we had this incredible private access into the Assyrian temple, which again is so mysterious. And it's sort of spoken of as, and you look at the more recent inscriptions as we walked in through that underground tunnel, and it's talking about the birthplace of Isis, which is the birthplace of secret esoteric knowledge, which probably incorporated what we call scientific knowledge. And, people had experiences inside that temple as well. I think that these people, these beings, whoever they were all about huge integration of different ideas that we separate today, and very comfortable with radically altering consciousness, states of consciousness, for accessing information, for spiritual ascension or progress. I don't really like the word ascension because it's sort of implying a physical aspect to it. And I also think they had a deep understanding and acceptance of the science of the soul, which is what I think these buildings were really trying to manipulate in a positive sense. They were enhancing the sense of soul and working on that side. And these are unforgettable locations, but the experiences and the impressions that they leave can last a lifetime. I mean, I don't know about you, Chris, but I feel different since coming back, and not just through excitement and having a good time.
Yeah, I feel like you mentioned it changes you, and I 100%. I definitely feel like coming back, I have a new perspective. I feel energized, and I really think you hit the nail on the head there. It seems like they had fused physics with metaphysics, and I think that's what we're really missing. If you look, there's in our science, there's not even a model for what consciousness is. And then you look to the east, and it seems like they've gotten so much further in the metaphysics realm, but not really in the physical realm, the material realm. And in the west now, we've gotten so far down the materialistic realm. I think much of this has been forgotten. It seems like what we're aiming towards is a unification or a reunification, if you will, of metaphysics and physics. But it
Well,
was so great having you on the show, JP. We're definitely going to have you on again in the near future. We'll continue this discussion. For audience members, comment down below if you want to hear JP again and me on rap basically on our trip through Egypt. Let us know what topics you want us to cover, and we'll definitely have you on again, JP. Thanks so much for being here.
thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. And there's so much more to talk about. We haven't even touched Mauritius, which has its own pyramids and Lion Mountain as well. So I won't open that can of worms just yet.
Okay, excellent. Part 2 is coming then. All right, thanks again.